3 ships, 3 different oceans of water, more than 100 years of investigation between them, and not one of them ever gave a straight answer. Before we go any further, I want to know where you are right now. What country? What city? Are you driving somewhere, or is it late and dark and everyone else in the house is asleep? Leave it in the comments. I go through everyone, and I like knowing who's out there in the quiet with me. Because tonight, we're going somewhere quiet. We're going out onto the water. And before we push off from the dock, one thing. If you like the feeling of a long story you can sink all the way into, I made something for that. It's called What the Mountain Keeps. 8 hours of folk horror. No ads. Nothing to break the spell. Just you in the dark and a voice that keeps going. The link is in the description, and it's pinned right at the top of the comments. Go find it after this. It'll be waiting. Now, let me tell you about 3 vessels that left port and never explained what happened next. The strange thing about the sea is how ordinary the beginning always sounds. A ship leaves a harbor. Men wave from the dock. Someone checks the cargo, signs a paper, notes the weather, and then the water closes over the whole thing like it was never there at all. We start in 1872, the oldest of the 3. There was a ship called the Mary Celeste, a brigantine, which is a 2-masted sailing vessel built for carrying cargo across long water. She was American. She'd been built up in Nova Scotia back in 1861 under a different name, the Amazon. And she'd had a rough enough life that some sailors thought she was unlucky before any of this ever happened. On her very first voyage, the story goes, her first captain took sick and died. A storm had once driven her onto the shore. She'd caught fire once. She'd collided with another ship in the English Channel and sunk it. Owners had come and gone, some of them ruined. By the time she got her new name, a run of superstitious sailors already looked at her sideways. She'd been repaired, renamed, made longer, given a second deck, and by 1872 she was, on paper, a sound and profitable working ship. But sailors remember things paper forgets. By the fall of that year, she had a new captain. His name was Benjamin Briggs, 37 years old, from Marion, Massachusetts, out of a family that had been going to sea for generations. His own father had been a ship's captain, and 2 of his brothers were captains too. Briggs had grown up on the water, the way other men grow up on a street they know by heart. People who knew him described a man who didn't drink, who studied his Bible, who was steady and fair and not the kind to take a foolish risk. He'd actually thought about giving the sea up. He and his brother had talked about opening a hardware business on dry land, something safe, something that lets a man sleep at home. Instead, he put a good chunk of his savings into a share of the Mary Celeste. He owned part of her now. He believed in her. On the 7th of November, 1872, she left New York Harbor bound for Genoa, in Italy, carrying 1,701 barrels of alcohol. Industrial alcohol, the kind used for fuel and manufacturing. Not the kind you drink, poisonous, in fact. Hold on to that cargo, because it comes back later. And Briggs didn't sail alone. He brought his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Sophia, 2 years old. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a man running from something. This was a man who trusted his ship so completely that he put his whole family on it. His little girl was 2. You don't do that with a vessel you're afraid of. He even had a sewing machine brought aboard for Sarah, and that small organ she loved, a harmonium for the long evenings at sea. This was a man setting up a floating home, not a man expecting trouble. There were 7 other men in the crew. His first mate, Albert Richardson, a man Briggs knew and had picked himself, well thought of, considered fit to command his own ship one day. A second mate named Andrew Gilling, a steward, and a handful of ordinary sailors, among them 2 German brothers, Volkert and Boz Lorenzen. Remember them too, 10 people in total, counting the captain and his family. 10 people went out onto the Atlantic on that ship. And here's where I need you to stay with me, because this is the part that has kept people awake for 150 years. The last entry in the ship's log was written on the 25th of November. 9 days out, everything normal. Position noted. The ship near the Azores, those islands out in the middle of the Atlantic. Just a working log kept by working men. The same dull, precise entries any ship makes on any ordinary crossing. And then nothing. The log simply stops, the way a sentence stops when someone gets up mid-word and never sits back down. The next time anyone saw the Mary Celeste was the 4th of December. She was spotted by another ship, a Canadian brigantine called the Dei Gratia, about 400 miles east of the Azores. Her captain was a seasoned Nova Scotian named David Morehouse. And here's a small, strange coincidence that would later cause Morehouse a lot of grief. He'd known Briggs. They'd reportedly dined together not long before both ships left New York, sailing the same route, days apart. Small world, the sea. The men on the Dei Gratia noticed something was wrong from a distance before they could even say what it was. The Mary Celeste was moving strangely, drifting. Her sails were set, but set wrong, some of them torn, some missing, some hanging loose. She was yawing across the water, wandering off her course and back again like a ship with no one holding the wheel. Because there was no one holding the wheel. Morehouse hailed her. No answer. He watched her for 2 hours, and nothing on that deck moved. So he sent 2 men over in a small boat. His first mate, Oliver DeVoe, and another sailor, pulling at the oars across choppy water toward a ship that was, by then, obviously wrong. They climbed aboard, and they walked through a ship where 10 people had simply stopped existing. Nobody there, not on deck, not below, not the captain, not his wife, not the 2-year-old, not a single one of the crew. But everything else was there. That's the part that breaks your brain a little. The cargo was intact, all 1,700 barrels more or less. There was food, there was fresh water, 6 months of provisions, still stowed. The crew's personal belongings were still in their quarters. Oilskin boots, pipes, the sailors' pouches of tobacco, the kind of thing a man grabs on his way out the door if he has even a second to think. Sarah Briggs's harmonium was still there. There were toys. There was no sign of a fight. No blood that anyone could honestly point to and say, there, that's what happened. No sign of pirates, and pirates would have stripped the cargo and the valuables and the ship's papers, and instead almost everything of value was untouched. The ship was, by every measure that mattered, seaworthy. There was some water down in the hold, a few feet of it, and one of the pumps had been taken apart. But it was not enough water to sink her, not enough to frighten an experienced captain like Briggs. She could have kept sailing to Italy on her own, and, in fact, more or less, she had been. The lifeboat was gone. That's the one thing missing that tells you something. It had been stowed over the main hatch, and it was gone, and it looked like it had been deliberately launched, not torn away by a wave. And a rope, a strong one, the main halyard, was found trailing off the ship into the water, frayed and snapped at the end. So somebody made a decision. Somebody. And it can only really have been Briggs, decided to get everyone off that ship and into the small boat. And you have to understand how enormous that is. A captain does not abandon a sound vessel. It is the last thing in the world a man like Briggs would do. It goes against everything the sea teaches you, because a big ship is survival, and a small open boat on the Atlantic in December is a coffin waiting for weather. He did it anyway. He put his wife and his baby daughter into that little boat and pushed off from a ship that was, by all evidence, perfectly capable of floating, which means whatever he saw, or thought he saw, in those hours we have no record of, was frightening enough to make a careful, sober, experienced man do the one thing careful, sober, experienced men never do. Now, what could do that? Let me walk you through it. And I'll be honest with you about the line between what we know and what we're guessing, because on a case this old, that line is the whole game. The theory that most serious people have landed on goes like this: that cargo of alcohol. When they checked the barrels later, 9 of them were found empty. The barrels were made of red oak, more porous than the white oak usually used, and they may have leaked. On a warm stretch after cold weather, those fumes could have built up in the hold and vented, maybe with a rumble, maybe with a sudden sharp report like a bang, or even a flash without a lasting fire. Imagine you're Briggs. You're carrying 1,700 barrels of something that can turn your ship into a fireball. You hear a bang below decks. You smell it. You think, in the space of a few seconds, that you're sitting on a bomb that is about to go off under your family. What do? You get everyone off, fast. You put them in the boat, and you tie the boat to the ship with a long rope. So you're clear of the blast, but you don't lose your ship. And you wait for the danger to pass so you can climb back aboard. And then the danger passed. There was no explosion. The ship sat there, fine, floating, saved, but the rope did not hold. Maybe the wind came up. Maybe the Mary Celeste, with her sails still set, simply caught a gust and pulled, and that frayed halyard snapped. And a small open boat with 10 people in it, including a 2-year-old girl, was suddenly loose on the open Atlantic, watching their ship, their sound and floating and perfectly fine ship, sail away from them on the wind, faster than any of them could pull at the oars. There's a newer version of this too. In 2002, a documentary maker named Anne McGregor spent years on the case, working with an oceanographer from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and with descendants of the crew. She looked at the ship's navigation and found that Briggs may have been sailing with a faulty chronometer, the instrument used to fix a ship's position. If his readings were off, he may have believed he was still far from land when in fact he was closing on the rocky island of Santa Maria in the Azores, at a pump that had been taken apart, so he couldn't get a clean reading of how much water was really in the hold. A captain who thinks his ship is taking on water, who thinks he's near dangerous rocks, who thinks he might be sinking, might just make the call to abandon and pull for a shore he believes is close. And then be wrong, and be lost. Either way, the ending is the same. Nobody was ever found. Not one of the 10. Not the boat, not a body. The sea took them and closed over the space where they'd been and told no one anything. But the mystery didn't end with a disappearance. It got stranger because of what people did with it afterward. The day Gradia's crew sailed the empty ship all the way to Gibraltar to claim salvage. which is the reward you get for bringing in a derelict vessel. And instead of a reward, they walked into suspicion. The man running the inquiry there was the Attorney General of Gibraltar, Frederick Solly Flood, and by every account, he was not an open-minded man. He smelled a crime, and he went looking for one to fit. He had the ship surveyed. When someone found some old marks on the prow and some reddish stains on the deck and on a sword in the captain's cabin, Solly Flood decided the stains were blood, and the marks were made by a blade, and he built a whole theory of murder out of it. His favorite version had Morehouse and the De Gracia crew hunting the Mary Celeste down, killing everyone aboard and inventing the ghost ship story to collect the salvage money. When that didn't hold, he floated another, that the crew had gotten into the alcohol, murdered the Briggs family in a drunken rage, and fled. But there was just one problem with all of it. The stains turned out not to be blood. Later analysis said they were rust, or natural discoloration. There was no evidence of murder. There was no evidence of anything except 10 people who got off a good ship for a reason that died with them. After more than 3 months, the court cleared Morehouse and his men of any wrongdoing. But listen to this, because it tells you how deep the unease ran. The salvage crew should have been paid handsomely for a valuable ship and cargo brought safely in. Instead, they were awarded only a fraction of what they were owed, roughly a sixth of the ship and cargo's value. It wasn't a guilty verdict. It was the sound of a court that couldn't prove anything wrong and still couldn't quite bring itself to say everyone was innocent. That's how strange this case was. Even the people clearing it of a crime paid out like they weren't sure. And then, a dozen years later, a young doctor named Arthur Conan Doyle, before Sherlock Holmes made him famous, published a short story loosely based on the case, full of invented horrors. And half the facts people think they know about the Mary Celeste today, the warm breakfast still on the table, the still burning pipes, the tea still steaming, come from that story and others like it, not from the ship. The real Mary Celeste was strange enough. People made her stranger because a mystery, once it gets loose, grows. Let me ask you something before we go on, and leave your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you think. Do you believe every one of these cases has a rational explanation waiting to be found? Or do you think some things happen out on the water that just never come back with an answer? Tell me, I'll be reading. And while we're out here in the middle of it, let me tell you who's bringing you this story. This is Beneath Darkness. We dig up the cases history tried to file away and forget, the ones that don't get a clean ending. If that's the kind of thing you can't look away from, subscribe. Stay with us in the dark a while. Now, let me take you forward. 46 years forward. To a war. And to a ship so big that people said she couldn't just disappear. She disappeared anyway. And unlike the Mary Celeste, she didn't leave an empty hole behind for us to puzzle over. She left nothing at all. In the spring of 1918, the world was at war, the First World War. And the United States Navy had a ship called the USS Cyclops. She was enormous for her time, 542 feet long. A collier, which means her job was carrying coal and later other heavy cargo to fuel and supply other ships across the ocean. She'd been launched in 1910, and she'd been working hard and working well for years, hauling coal, supporting the fleet, even helping move refugees before America entered the war. She was named after the Cyclops, the one-eyed giants out of the old Greek myths, and there's something almost too fitting about that, a giant that vanishes into the sea. But that's just the name. I'm not going to pretend it means anything. The man in command was a lieutenant commander named George Worley. And Worley is where this story grows a strange human darkness, because Worley was not a simple man, and he may not even have been who he said he was. The records describe a hard captain, a harsh one, a man who berated his crew and ran his ship with a heavy hand. There are accounts of him wandering the decks at odd hours, dressed in long underwear and a derby hat, giving orders that made no sense. He drank. He was, by more than one account, erratic. And here's the part that made everything worse once the ship vanished. Worley had German heritage. Some sources say he'd been born in Germany under a completely different name, Johann Friedrich Wichmann, and had come into the United States illegally decades earlier, jumping ship in San Francisco and building a whole new American identity. And this was wartime, war against Germany. His officers didn't like him, his crew didn't trust him, and behind his back they gave him a nickname that said it all. They called him the Damned Dutchman. Dutchman from Deutsch, meaning German. In early 1918, the Cyclops was down in South America, part of her wartime work, helping fuel Allied ships in the South Atlantic. And when it came time to head home, she took on a cargo that she was never really built for, manganese ore. Manganese is a metal used in making steel, and steel was everything in a war, so it was strategic, valuable cargo. It was also dense and heavy, far heavier for its size than the coal the Cyclops was designed to carry. And here's the number that matters. Her safe maximum load was around 8,000 tons. She left Brazil carrying something like 10,000 tons, maybe more, of that dense ore. Port officials in Rio noted she was riding low, her hull pulled down past the normal waterline mark. She was overloaded by people who'd never handled that kind of cargo before, with the one experienced loading officer reportedly under arrest and confined to quarters. Hold on to all of that. It's the most likely answer, and I'll come back to it. There were more than 300 people aboard. 306 by the count that's come down to us. Crew, officers, and passengers, including some senior figures being carried home. 306 people. And she was hurt before she even started. One of her 2 engines had a cracked cylinder and wasn't working. Worley had reported it. A survey board looked at it, agreed it was broken, and then recommended she sail home anyway, on one good engine, dropping her speed to about 10 knots. Slow, heavy, half-powered. Overloaded with a cargo she'd never carried. That's the ship that started north. She left Rio in mid-February, reached Salvador on the Brazilian coast on the 20th. 2 days later, she set out for Baltimore with no stops scheduled. And then, unexpectedly, she put in at Barbados in the Caribbean in early March to take on more coal and water and supplies. That Barbados stop gives us the last strange documents in the whole case, because the American consul there, a man named Charles Ludlow Livingston, met Worley, looked over the situation, and something about it bothered him enough to put his worries in writing. He noted the ship seemed to have taken on more than she needed. He noted the captain seemed secretive. He noted, and this is the detail that would haunt the investigation, that there were a great many German names among the crew and passengers. One of the passengers was another American consul general coming home from Brazil, a man widely disliked for his own pro-German sympathies. Livingston, reading all of this, wrote that he had a bad feeling, that something worse than an ordinary sinking might be coming. She left Barbados on the 4th of March, 1918, bound for Baltimore, a straight run up the coast, the kind experienced ships made all the time. The last confirmed message was ordinary and businesslike, essentially. Arrived Barbados, expect to reach Baltimore the 13th of March. And then the biggest ship in that part of the United States Navy, more than 500 feet of steel, 306 living souls aboard, sailed off the edge of the known world. She never reached Baltimore. She never radioed for help. And this is the thing that makes the back of your neck go cold. Because by 1918, ships had radios, and a ship in trouble sends a signal. That's what you do. You have time, usually, even in a disaster, to get out a few words, a position, a cry for help, something. The Cyclops sent nothing. No distress call, no wreckage that anyone could find, no lifeboats washing up on a beach somewhere with a story to tell, no oil slick, no bodies. Not one man out of 306 ever turned up to explain what happened. When she was overdue, they searched, and they searched hard because the loss was almost impossible to believe. Ships combed the route. The first assumption was that a German submarine had gotten her. It was war. She was a fat, slow-moving, valuable target full of steel-making ore, limping along on one engine. A U-boat made perfect sense. But here's what quietly took that theory apart. After the war ended, investigators went through the captured German naval records, every log they could get their hands on, and there was nothing. No U-boat claimed the Cyclops. No German commander recorded an attack in that place at that time. And think about it, a submarine crew that sank the largest American naval vessel of the war would have logged it, would have been decorated for it, would have made absolutely sure command knew. The Germans had no idea what happened to her either. She was as much a mystery to the enemy as she was to her own navy. So it wasn't the enemy. Then what? This is where the theories multiply, and I want to be honest about which ones actually hold weight, because it would be easy to sell you the wild one. The most probable explanation is the least dramatic, and it's built out of everything I asked you to hold on to. That overloaded ship, that dense manganese ore poured in by inexperienced hands, maybe shifting in the hold, that one dead engine in the slow, half-powered crawl. And then, on the 10th of March, the day after the Cyclops was rumored to have been sighted, a violent storm swept through the Virginia Capes area, right in her path. Put it all together. An overloaded ship, badly balanced, underpowered, meeting heavy seas. A vessel like that can roll over and go down shockingly fast. Fast enough that no one reaches the radio because there's no time. Fast enough that she plunges in deep water and the deep water keeps her. That is what most serious historians believe happened. She capsized, or her hull failed under a load it was never meant to carry and she went down in minutes. But it doesn't explain everything, and that's exactly why the case has never died. It doesn't explain why, in more than a century of searching, not a single confirmed trace of her has ever been found. Sinking ships leave debris fields. Marine archaeologists have gone looking deliberately, and nothing on that seabed matches the Cyclops. She is simply not where a sunken ship is supposed to be. And then there are the darker human theories, the ones that grew out of Livingston's uneasy telegram. Did Worley, the man who might have been a German named Wichmann, do something to his own ship? Was there a mutiny, given how much his crew hated him? Was there sabotage, some plot involving the pro-German passengers to hand a Navy ship to the enemy? People wondered all of this loudly in the anti-German fear of the time. But here's the thing. The German records that cleared the U-boats also failed to show any plot, any handover, any secret arrival of an American collier in a German port. If Worley meant to betray his ship, there is no sign he ever delivered her anywhere. Whatever happened to the Cyclops? She never made it to anyone. She just stopped being. And then there's the footnote that turns the whole thing cold. The Cyclops had 3 sister ships, vessels built to the same design in the same era. One, the Jupiter, went on to a long life and even became the Navy's first aircraft carrier. But the other 2, the Proteus and the Nereus, both vanished in the Atlantic in 1941 during the Second World War. Both had been sold off to civilian owners, and both, when they disappeared, were carrying heavy loads of dense metal ore. The same kind of cargo, the same ocean, the same nothing left behind. 3 ships of the same family, all swallowed by the same water, all carrying the same crushing weight. Now, a careful person will tell you that's the answer, not the mystery. That there was a flaw in how those ships handled dense ore, a structural weakness in the class, and it caught up with all 3 of them the same way, decades apart. And that's probably right. That's the rational reading, and I lean toward it. But I'll tell you what it feels like, sitting here in the dark telling you about it. It feels like a family curse. It feels like something learned the shape of those ships and came back, twice more, to finish what it started. I know that isn't evidence. I know. But you asked yourself the question I put to you earlier, whether everything has an explanation. This is the kind of case that sits right on that line and refuses to fall to either side. To this day, the USS Cyclops has never been found. 306 men, the single largest loss of life in United States naval history that did not come from combat. And it came from nothing anyone can name. They declared her lost in June of 1918. The man who signed that declaration, as it happens, was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time, a young man named Franklin Roosevelt, who would one day be president. He put his name to a piece of paper that said 306 men were gone, cause unknown. And the official Navy summary of the investigation, decades later, still says essentially the same thing. Many theories have been advanced, but none that satisfactorily accounts for her disappearance, cause unknown. More than 100 years later, that is still officially the best answer we have. Are you still with me? Good. Stay close, because the last one is the one that might be closest to home. It's the newest. It's the one people my age and older grew up hearing about, maybe even heard sung on the radio. And it's the one where we can almost hear the men's own voices, right up until the very end. November 1975, Lake Superior. Now, I know what you might be thinking. A lake. We were out on the ocean this whole time, and now we're on a lake. How bad can a lake be? Let me stop you right there, because the Great Lakes are not lakes the way you're picturing them. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area. You cannot see across it. It is hundreds of miles wide and hundreds of feet deep and cold enough, year-round, to kill a person in minutes. It makes its own weather. And it has swallowed something like 6,000 ships and 30,000 lives since people started keeping count. The sailors who work it do not call it a lake with any comfort in their voice. They call it what it is. A cold, deep, hungry sea that just happens to be surrounded by land. And the ship at the center of this one was a legend even before she sank. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald. When she was launched in 1958, she was the biggest ship on the Great Lakes, 729 feet long, a giant ore carrier hauling taconite, which is processed iron ore packed into little pellets, down from the mines to the steel mills. People called her the Mighty Fitz, the pride of the American side. She set cargo records. Crowds came to watch her load. Sailors and dock crews knew her on sight, and to ride her was considered a good berth. And there's an odd little detail from the very beginning, the kind of thing you only notice looking back. At her launching in 1958, things kept going wrong. It took 3 tries to smash the champagne bottle against her hull. When she finally slid into the water, she went in sideways and sent up a wave that soaked the crowd, and one man watching the whole thing reportedly died of a heart attack that day. People laughed it off at the time. A rough launch, nothing more. It's only later that a rough launch starts to feel like something else. Her captain that final season was Ernest McSorley, 63 years old, more than 40 years on the Great Lakes, and a master's license he'd earned young. One of the most respected captains on the water, the kind other captains trusted and deferred to. And this trip, this one, was meant to be one of his last. He was near the end of his career, thinking about retirement, and some of the men aboard had sailed together for decades and were talking about hanging it up after that same season. One last run before winter shut the shipping down for the year. On the 9th of November, 1975, the Fitzgerald left Superior, Wisconsin, in the early afternoon. She was loaded with more than 26,000 tons of taconite, bound for a steel mill near Detroit. There were 29 men aboard. The youngest was 20 years old. The oldest was Captain McSorley himself. The day they left was strangely, unseasonably warm, mild, and to an old sailor on the lakes in November, that is not a comfort. That is a warning, because that kind of warmth that late in the year means something violent is on its way to replace it. A storm was building down in the Great Plains and moving toward the lakes. McSorley knew it was coming. Another big freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, was traveling the same general route, and the two captains talked it over by radio and made a careful, sensible choice. They would take the northern route across Lake Superior, hugging the Canadian shore, where the high land would give them some shelter from the worst of the weather coming down from the northwest. It was the cautious call. And this is worth sitting with, because McSorley had a reputation as an aggressive captain, a man who pushed his ship and his schedule. This time, on his last season, he played it safe. He did the careful thing, and it wasn't enough, because what came down on Lake Superior on the 10th of November 1975 was not an ordinary autumn blow. It was a monster. Winds near hurricane force, sustained winds over 50 knots, with gusts reported up around 70, and some reports higher still. And the waves. The waves built to 25 feet, and the men on the Anderson, trailing behind, reported rogue seas rolling through at 35 feet. 35 feet. That's a moving wall of black water taller than a 3-story house, coming out of the snow in the dark, one after another, all afternoon and into the night. The two ships pushed east through it, staying in radio contact. The Anderson maybe 10 miles or so behind. And here's what sets this case apart from the other two, what makes it almost unbearable to follow. We don't have to guess at the Fitzgerald's final hours. We can trace them almost in real time, because it's all there in the radio record, in the words that passed between those two ships across the storm. For once, in these 3 stories, we can actually hear them. In the middle of the afternoon, the Anderson's captain watched on his radar as the Fitzgerald passed dangerously close to a shoal, a shallow, rocky area near Caribou Island. Close enough that it worried him. Close enough that later, some would wonder whether she scraped bottom right there and started bleeding without anyone knowing. Not long after, McSorley came on the radio. He had damage, topside damage. Some of his deck equipment, a vent, a fence rail was down, and the ship had developed a list, a lean to one side, which for a fully loaded freighter is a bad sign. He had his pumps running to push the water back out. He asked the Anderson to stay close and keep an eye on him. Then it got worse. Both of the Fitzgerald's radars went down. Gone. In near whiteout snow, in the dark, on a lake throwing 30-foot waves at him, McSorley had just been struck blind. He got on the radio and asked the Anderson to help guide him, to track him on their radar and tell him where he was and where he was heading, because he could no longer see anything for himself. The storm was knocking out navigation aids all over the region, radar stations, the beacon at Whitefish Point that would have guided him to safety. One by one, every tool the man had was being taken away from him. He kept reporting in. To another vessel, he said his ship was listing badly. And listen to how he described that storm in his own words, this man with more than 40 years on that water. A man who had surely seen the worst the lakes could do. He said it was one of the worst seas he had ever been in. One of the worst. From him. Let that sit. The Anderson stayed with him through it, tracking, talking, watching that one blip crawl slower and slower across the radar screen toward the safety of Whitefish Bay. McSorley had every pump on the ship running now, and to the experienced captain of the Anderson, listening to that, it meant only one thing: water was getting into the cargo hold faster than the pumps could throw it out. But the Fitzgerald was still moving, still fighting toward shelter, so close now, only a couple of hours from the calm water of the bay. Around 10 minutes past 7 in the evening, the Anderson called the Fitzgerald on the radio. Just a routine check, and to pass along word of another ship in the area. And McSorley answered. 4 words. We are holding our own. That's it. Calm. Almost easy. A man telling another man, we're hurt, but we're managing. We're going to make it in. There is no fear in it. No goodbye. Nothing that sounds like the end of anything. We are holding our own. The mate on the Anderson said something ordinary back. Something like, okay, fine, I'll talk to you later. He would not, because about 10 minutes after that, the man on the Anderson looked down at his radar screen. The Fitzgerald was not there. She was gone. No blip, where 729 feet of steel and 29 men had been a moment before. He tried the radio. Nothing. He tried again. Nothing but the storm. He strained to see her lights out in the snow, and there were no lights. The Edmund Fitzgerald had gone to the bottom of Lake Superior in the space between 2 sweeps of a radar screen. No distress call. There hadn't been time for one. She dropped so suddenly that the man who had said, we are holding our own, 4 calm words in 10 short minutes earlier, never got the chance to say anything else at all. Whatever finally happened to her happened in seconds. All 29 men died. Not one body was ever recovered. And I'll leave that there, out of respect for those men and for the families, some of whom are still living. Very cold, very deep water keeps what it takes. The Anderson, to her enormous credit, turned around. That other crew, having survived the same storm, sailed back out into it to search for survivors they must have known. In their hearts, they would not find. They found an empty, furious stretch of water. A few days later, a Navy aircraft flying over with special detection gear located the wreck. She was down about 530 feet, and she was broken clean into two large pieces on the lake floor, the front section and the stern lying not far apart, surrounded by a scattered field of her own torn-apart body. And here is the thing that puts the Fitzgerald in the same haunted company as the Mary Celeste and the Cyclops, even with the wreck found. Even with all of it lying right there on the bottom, mapped and filmed and studied for 50 years by the best people in the world, nobody can tell you for certain why she sank. There are theories, and they are good ones, argued by serious people who have given their lives to this. Maybe her hatch covers weren't fully clamped down, and all through that storm the great waves washing over her deck poured tons of water into the cargo hold. Little by little, until she lost so much buoyancy that her prow simply drove down into a wave and never came back up. That's essentially what the Coast Guard concluded. Maybe she'd wounded her hull on that shoal near Caribou Island in the afternoon and had been quietly flooding from below for hours. Maybe it was the waves themselves, a series of 3 giant seas that Great Lakes sailors call the Three Sisters, rolling over her in quick succession. 1, 2, 3, burying her deck faster than she could ever shed the water. Maybe it was several of those things at once, each making the others worse, but no one knows. 50 years, multiple expeditions, submersibles and remote cameras, the finest marine historians alive? And the honest answer, from the people who have studied her hardest and longest, is that the precise cause will most likely never be known. She keeps that, the way the other two kept theirs. The wreck is a protected gravesite now. Canadian law keeps divers away, with a wide restricted zone around her, because 30 families consider that spot the resting place of their fathers and husbands and sons. In 1995, a joint expedition raised her bronze bell from the bottom. And today, it hangs in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point as a memorial. They left a replacement bell down on the wreck, engraved with the names of the crew so she wouldn't be without one. And every year, on the 10th of November, people gather, and they say the 29 names out loud, one by one, and they ring a bell 29 times. Once, for each man, the mighty Fitz took down with her into the cold. 3 ships. 1872, 1918, 1975, a sailing brigantine, a Navy giant, a Great Lakes legend, different centuries, different waters, different men, and the same silence at the end of every single one. The Mary Celeste gave us an empty ship and no bodies. The Cyclops gave us no ship at all and no bodies. The Fitzgerald gave us the wreck, the voices, the storm, almost everything we could have asked for, and still would not give up the one thing we actually wanted, which is why. I've spent a lot of time with these 3, and here is what stays with me when I turn off the lights. It isn't the horror of them exactly. It's the ordinariness of the beginning, every single time. A captain who trusted his ship so completely he brought his baby daughter aboard. 306 men on a routine run home from a war they were surviving. 29 sailors on one last trip before retirement, taking the careful route, doing everything right. None of them thought they were sailing into a mystery. Not one of them felt the story close around them. They thought they were going home, and the water had other plans, and it has never once explained them. So I'll ask you the same thing I asked you at the very start, now that you've heard all 3 of them side by side. What do you honestly think happened out there? Was it always something ordinary? Cargo and weather and bad luck and human error that we just can't see clearly from this far away? Or is there something about deep water, something old, that takes things and keeps its reasons to itself? Leave your theory in the comments. I go through every one of them, and the good ones stay with me longer than I'd like to admit. And if you know another case like these 3, a disappearance that was never given its answer, tell me about it down below. It might just be the next story I bring you. Before you go, one more time, that long dark story I told you about at the start. What the Mountain Keeps. 8 hours of folk horror, no ads, made for exactly this kind of night. It's waiting in the description and pinned right at the top of the comments. And go get lost in it. Stay with us for the next one. Until then, keep a light on. The water doesn't.